Good evening and good morning to Mika-san and other members in Japan and Asia, and welcome. I'm Gyuk Shin, Director of the Schoenstein Asia Pacific Research Center, and thank you for joining us online for today's discussion. This is the sixth of our four webinar series, Perfect Storm, Climate Change in Asia. So we held the first one in September with the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And if you missed that, please check our website. So throughout this full quarter, our speakers have been discussing the climate change impacts and risk in the Asia Pacific region, adaptation and mitigation strategies, and policy responses. So far, we have focused on a specific geographic area or thematic issue. And today, I'm very happy to say that our focus is on Japan. So the next one will be on November 16th, a week from today, and please check our website. So I'm very happy to introduce my colleague, Kyo Chuchui, who directs our Japan program. So he will introduce our speakers today and moderate the discussions to follow. So thanks again for joining us today, and please enjoy. So without further ado, Kyo.
Thank you, Georg. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the APAC webinar series, Japan's Energy Policy in Flux, the Uncertain Future of Renewables, Nuclear Energy, and Carbon Neutrality. I am delighted to facilitate this session today. And as the title suggests, energy policy in Japan seems to be in a transition as the new Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida, came into office about a month ago, creating some doubts about the Japanese government's commitment to reduce carbon emission by 46% from 2013 levels by 2030. That was a commitment made by Kishida's predecessor, Yoshihide Suga. And after a month in office and having just visited Glasgow for the COP26 climate summit, where does Prime Minister Kishida and his administration stand? And what is the long-term trajectory of Japan's energy policy as it seeks to identify the optimal energy mix that would get Japan to carbon neutrality by 2050? To answer these questions, we have two wonderful experts on the topic, Phillip Lipscy and Mika Obayashi today. Phillip is currently an associate professor of political science at the University of Toronto, where he is also the chair in Japanese politics and global affairs, and the director of the Center for the Study of Global Japan at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. His research has examined international cooperation and competition, especially in the context of international organizations, and his current research focuses on the politics of energy and climate change in Japan and East Asia. He was on the faculty here at Stanford, both in political science and at APAC. And he also did his bachelor's degree here at Stanford. So he's a familiar face, and he still has many friends and fans here at Stanford. Our second speaker is Mika Obayashi. Mika-san, do you want to turn on your camera? Who is the director at Renewable Energy Institute, a premier research institute on energy issues in Japan. And she has had a long and successful career as a researcher and also an advocate for issues around climate change and sustainable energy, having founded and worked at a number of important organizations such as Citizens Nuclear Information Center, the Institute for Sustainable Energy Policies, and the International Renewable Energy Agency before taking the current position in 2011. And in 2017, she received the Global Leadership Award in advancing solar energy policy from the International Solar Energy Society. She just came back from the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, and we are very fortunate to have her fresh insights on what took place there. So we'll first have Philip's presentation. He will give us an overview of Japan's energy policy, its history, and its current status. And then we'll have Mika-san share her views on Japan's energy future and her observations and analyses of the COP26 in Glasgow. We'll have some discussion afterwards, and we will take your questions. So audience, please submit all your questions in the Q&A function as we go along. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Philip. Philip, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Giwook and Kyo, for the very kind introductions. And it's so wonderful to see many familiar faces in the audience as well, from Stanford and elsewhere as well. So thank you very much for having me and for joining this conversation this evening or this morning, depending on where you are, I suppose. So I'll cover, as Kyo mentioned, some of the context of Japanese energy and climate policy. So this is just a figure of Japan's CO2 emissions in metric tons per capita from 1990, the base year that was originally used for the Kyoto Protocol. So that red line is Japan's emissions per capita. And the black line in the middle of this figure was the Kyoto Protocol target that Japan had committed to, an emissions reduction from those 1990 levels. And you notice that basically Japan came close to reducing its emissions in line with the Kyoto Protocol, but mostly because of the 2008 global financial crisis. If that hadn't happened, essentially the trend in Japanese emissions was almost kind of straight up, not dramatically increasing, but definitely not decreasing during the entire period covered by the Kyoto Protocol. And subsequently, after the financial crisis, the trend almost completely reversed, right? And emissions grew dramatically, particularly after the Fukushima disaster. But more recently, we have seen something of a declining emissions trend. And it's an interesting question as to whether this is something that's likely to persist. Turning to Japan's energy supply mix, well, you notice this goes back to 1960. There's an important trend shift that took place in Japan in the 1970s in response to the energy shock, the oil shock that started in 1973, when Japan really managed to slow down its imports of oil. Oil imports were growing dramatically right until then, and then they basically flatlined thanks to energy efficiency, so using less energy to produce the same amount of economic output, but also a shift into particularly nuclear power generation. And you see towards the end of this figure, where the line shows the Fukushima disaster, nuclear being absent from Japan's energy mix poses a significant problem. So Japan is producing less energy now than it did 2 decades ago. And nuclear has been gradually coming back online, but it's probably not going to go back to its full potential from prior to the Fukushima disaster. So Japan has been facing some significant challenges in terms of energy and climate change. The 1970s energy shock transition, which I've looked at in my own work and as have others, I think consisted of 2, broadly speaking, components. On the demand side, something that I've described as efficiency clientelism. There was basically a set of arrangements that the Japanese government put into place in which the LDP, the ruling party of Japan, redistributed rents and revenues that were raised from high energy prices in Japan. These were redistributed to organized supporters of the ruling party in sectors like agriculture and infrastructure. So the money was basically used to support core organized supporters of the LDP. Japanese consumers faced some of the highest energy prices in the world for things like electricity, natural gas, the use of automobiles, which it continues to be quite expensive in Japan. And these were all induced by policy measures. The people who suffered the most from these policies were diffuse consumers, right? The average Japanese person who, because energy costs were so high, ended up conserving energy very carefully. And this helped Japan achieve greater energy efficiency. And as a side effect at the time, moderate growth in greenhouse gas emissions that then might have happened otherwise. On the supply side, so where the energy is being produced, MITI played an important role in facilitating a supply side transition, particularly focusing on nuclear, which I alluded to in the figure earlier. But there have been some important political shifts in Japan. The 1994 electoral reform is an important one that really shifts the balance of political power in an important way. The influence of diffuse consumers has relatively become more important in Japanese politics in recent years compared to those organized interest groups that previous policy measures in the energy sector benefited. And of course, you have the Hashimoto administrative reforms that have elevated the role of politicians relative to bureaucrats, and especially the prime minister in policy. And what I've argued in my existing work is that these political shifts made it difficult to maintain and sustain the old energy policy arrangements that Japan had used since the 1970s to achieve a degree of energy efficiency and energy conservation. So what does post mid-1990s roughly Japanese energy policy look like? A lot of the policy debates over the past several decades in Japan have actually focused on how do we reduce energy prices? For example, how do we cut gasoline taxes? How do we make electricity more affordable? And not on dealing with climate change, which in many ways requires the opposite kind of policy, carbon taxes, for example. And we've seen reformist politicians from both the LDP and opposition parties attack policies that contribute to high energy prices. There's been a decline in energy-related rents to organized groups like the utility sector. And if you look at the data, which I'll show you in a second, we've seen a stagnation of Japanese energy prices, energy conservation efforts, even as other countries have begun to take climate change seriously and really move their policies to try to address the global challenge. So this is a figure from my upcoming book, right? So household energy prices in Japan compared to other OECD countries. The black thick line is Japan from 1980 to about 2016 or so. So you see that for a while, Japan's electricity prices were the highest in the world, right? And if electricity prices are high, consumers will tend to conserve. But today, those prices levels have stagnated and other countries have really caught up, and Japan is now much more middle of the pack in terms of electricity prices. You can go through a whole bunch of these. I could go through figures like this all day long, right? So if you look at automobile-related taxes, of course, automobile is an energy inefficient form of transportation, particularly if it's gasoline automobiles. Gasoline taxes and automobile-related taxes were raised routinely right until about the mid-90s, and then much of the debate has focused on how do you lower these, and they tend not to be raised afterwards. This is just looking at automobile weight taxes and acquisition taxes, really fallen off a cliff. And so from a price perspective, this encourages Japanese consumers to purchase automobiles instead of using public transportation, for example. So, you know, that's the demand side. So the argument is basically that on the demand side, it's become very difficult for Japanese politicians to ratchet up energy prices in order to encourage conservation. The politics are not really amenable to that like they used to be. But even if demand side policies stagnate, in theory, decarbonization should be possible through supply side policies. So essentially changing the way you generate electricity, for example, relying more on renewables instead of coal, that reduces CO2 emissions. However, if you look at where Japan stands on supply side policies, it's actually also lagged here as well. And basically, I think this comes down to resistance from METI, electric utilities, and some private businesses, internal divisions within the ruling party, the LDP, and the long rule of the Abe government, which I'll talk about as well. The Abe government, in my view, prioritized economic growth and low energy prices rather than climate change mitigation. So why don't we go through some of these? So this is a very simplified view of where the resistance to supply side transition comes from in Japan. So I think on the industry side, there's some division now. But the resistance tends to come over concerns about reliability of renewable energy sources, the potential cost. Both of these are being mitigated through technology and innovation, but that concern has been expressed. Japan has some technological advantages in areas like hydrogen fuel cells and quote unquote clean coal technology that are not necessarily the cleanest sources of energy. So Japanese policy has tended to prioritize technologies that may not necessarily be the most expedient ways to reduce carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Electric utilities have also tended to resist aggressive climate policies, and I think this could be chalked up to sunk costs in the existing power generation infrastructure, right? If you have a big rollout of renewables, it makes it less necessary to maintain coal-fired power plants or nuclear power plants and so forth. And METI has tended to basically take these interests into account and is the bureaucracy that has over the past 2 decades, at least, been on the side of resisting an ambitious supply-side transition to address climate change in Japan. And I think a really interesting example of this came up recently, and it concerned Kono Taro, who ran for the LDP leadership and lost eventually. But right before that leadership election for the LDP presidency, there was a quote unquote scandal that emerged. And it basically was a leaked recording of Kono meeting in his capacity as reform minister with a bunch of senior METI bureaucrats. And it was leaked to a Japanese tabloid with the headline that basically Kono was engaging in power harassment of METI bureaucrats. But if you read the fine print, if you actually read what they were talking about, Kono was upset basically because METI was really pushing back hard on any kind of proactive climate change policy, right? So for example, the main thing that Kono got criticized for in this article was he ended up sort of raising his voice because METI was playing these word games, right? So that the renewable energy target in Japan's policy would be about 36 to 38% rather than greater than, which he suggested would be a better target, that let's move beyond 36, 38 if we can. But METI was trying to insist on it should be about that range so that we're not committing to an overly ambitious policy. METI had inserted text in the government document claiming that Japan has geographic disadvantages and therefore is not very suitable for renewable energy. And it was also refusing to revise an energy market scheme that essentially forces renewable energy producers to subsidize existing power plants, including coal. So I think the fact that METI bureaucrats saw this and basically said, if we leak this, it's going to hurt Kono rather than hurt us, tells you a lot about METI's view of climate change and where it sits in these debates. And this connects as well to the Abe government, which ruled from 2012 to 2020, the longest lasting government in Japanese history. And I'm showing a book cover here that Takeo Hoshi and I edited while we were faculty at Stanford. One of the contributions to this book is a chapter by Trevor and Surti and I, where we basically characterize Abe's energy and climate change policy as Abe energynomics, right? It's basically using energy and climate policy in the service of the macroeconomic growth objectives of Abenomics, not focusing on climate change. And it's well known at this point that METI played a very outsized role within Abe's inner circle, and that was reflected in policy. You had a series of policy measures of the Abe government, like the rollback of the feed-in tariffs that were implemented by the DPJ. Abe becomes very faces widespread criticism for his government support of coal-fired power plants, both in Japan and abroad. And the Paris Agreement target that Japan puts out during this period was widely criticized, basically for using accounting gimmicks and even then being quite unambitious. And just to show you some sense of Japan's international reputation, right? So this is a expert evaluation of Japanese climate policy put out by German Watch, right? So higher numbers here indicate that Japan is ranking high, Low numbers indicate that Japan is towards the bottom of the rankings. And you see that on international policy, Japan hasn't always been seen as a laggard. There are points where it was sort of in the higher end of countries ranked. There were some disappointments during the DPJ years when Hatoyama seemed to come out with a strong pledge, but then disappoints. But the punchline here is that during the Abe government, Japan's international reputation on climate change really becomes tarnished, right? Japan is widely seen as more of a problem country on global climate change cooperation, not really taking the issue as seriously as it potentially could. And here's another ranking, right? The Yale Environmental Performance Index, where Japan actually manages to rank below the United States, which was at the time led by Donald Trump, which was, who was kind of clearly one of these climate change deniers, right? So even with that kind of leadership, Japan manages to be ranked below the United States in 116. So this is not to say, Japan was a hotbed of climate change denialism, for example. Japanese politicians tend, regardless of their policy implementation, to say, we believe in climate change, we believe it's a serious issue. In the Japanese case, the issue was policy, right? The policies weren't really consistent with the rhetoric that you were hearing from Abe and his government. So the Suga government, I would argue, began to change this. Suga made a point of emphasizing climate change very early on as he came to power. And I have a photo of Joe Biden here because it probably had a lot to do with the fact that the Biden administration was also emphasizing climate change. And Japan wanted to get on board and show that it's a good ally, and it sees eye to eye with the United States on this important issue. But the targets that Japan announced were also legitimately a major improvement over what came before, right? The 46% plus, right? Hopefully 50% emissions reduction target by 2013 was a major increase in ambition from the 26% that came before. The renewables target was almost doubled. And importantly, Japan enshrined 2050 net zero target that CO2 emissions would go to net zero by 2015. So that's part of Japanese law now. There was some movement away from supporting coal-fired power plants. It hasn't been total, so there's some dissatisfaction that remains, but there was meaningful movement there. It was still short on details and implementation, but of course, Suga only ruled for about a year. So I don't know if that's a legitimate criticism or whether with more time, he might have done more. And so then that finally leads us to where Japan is going now under Prime Minister Kishida. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty here right now. The public statements from the Japanese government have indicated that Japan will continue Suga's relatively ambitious policies. But as a reminder, Abe also said things that were quite positive about climate change, right? So we have to look at where the actual policy implementation is headed. From a personnel perspective, Suga, Kono, and Koizumi, who were very proactive on climate change when they played influential roles in the previous government, have really been sidelined, not because of their support of climate change, but because they essentially were on the wrong side of the leadership election. But Abe, of course, was playing the role of kingmaker and enabled in many ways Kishida to rise to power. And as I mentioned, he has not been in the past sort of a strong advocate of climate change measures. Aso, who's also influential, managed to say almost immediately after Kishida came to power that Hokkaido rice tastes better because of climate change. And, sort of Aso is well known for putting his foot in his mouth, but not a good sign there either. And Japan, of course, just recently won Fossil of the Day at COP26 for Kishida's speech supporting thermal power generation, essentially, that Japan's not doing enough to get off of coal. So I don't think the prognosis is necessarily pessimistic. There's still much to observe and see in Kishida's policy, but the initial prognosis, I would say, may not be as optimistic as one would like, given the progress that was made under the Suga government. But I hope that Mika-san can fill in the current policy side in the next presentation. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. Now I'd like to turn it over to Mika-san.
Thank you very much, Philip-san, and also Kyo-san for the introduction. And then I think that I will share the screen now. Just a moment. Okay, this is my screen. I think that you are seeing this one. Is it okay?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So I will focus on the renewable energy policies and then also the Japan's decarbonization policy. So I was requested to have some flavor of the COP26 which I was attending until Sunday. I just came back from COP26, but actually the conference itself is going on and on. Usually COP is a 2 weeks conference, and then this time that we have a 2 weeks plus one, that the previous day, that the 31st October. And then, so the discussion is still going on. I just would like to explain what the COP is. In 1992, the United Nations adopted the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It calls UNFCCC, in which all UN member states agreed to work together to combat climate change. So COP26, as it is called, will be the 26th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC. COP21, held in France in 2015, adopted the Paris Agreement, an international framework for tackling climate change after 2020. It set out to limit the average global temperature rise to less than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and preferably 1.5 degrees. In line with this, all countries are required to review their greenhouse gas reduction targets every 5 years after 2015 and submit them to the United Nations. So the COP26 is the 5th anniversary of the adoption of the Paris Agreement. Is scheduled to take place in 2020, but was postponed for a year due to the new COVID-19. This COP26 is therefore the first time that the global reduction plan will be discussed based on the updated target of each country. So the key to success will be whether the COP26 decision text includes enhanced reduction target, such as requesting countries to raise their target without waiting for the 2025 target or like that. And then actually that from the beginning of this COP26, there are so many pledges are going out. So the main focus is on whether we can put forward the message that countries' greenhouse gas reduction targets to be strengthened. There are so many initiatives at the forum of the COPs. And then one prominent activity is initiated by the UK government, happened to be a host country of this COP26, that called the Powering Past Coal Alliance. And the UK announced that this alliance is now joined by 165 countries and regions. And also that UK said that secures 190 strong coalition of countries and organizations at COP26, with countries such as Poland, Vietnam, Egypt, Chile, and Morocco announcing commitments to phase out coal power. And also, there is approach for India last week. India announces to raise renewable energy target to 50% by 2030, and also carbon neutralization by 2070. So 2070 is a far from now, and then almost all countries is announcing that the 2050, and then China announced the 2060. But this is the first time India committed to the carbon neutral announcement. So it is not by the criticism, but welcome at the COP discussion. And also Denmark and Costa Rica will soon announce the formal establishment of Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance called BOGA, probably tomorrow, 11th November. And then we are just watching how many countries will join this alliance. So for example, IEA estimated if those kind of oil pledges become realized, then we could reach 1.8 or 1.9 degrees by the end of this century. So the COP is now discussing those kind of new commitment by the new countries. And among those discussions that I would like to introduce that how the Japan is seen by other countries and then also in the global context. For example, this is just released yesterday, annual report released by the German Watch. And it's called the Climate Change Performance Index 2022. And actually that our institute is collaborating with this performance index together with other think tank and NGOs. And then that if you see that Japan ranked as the 45, and it's actually the similar as the last year, and then not so much kind of splendid or advanced countries to be seen by the think tank and NGOs. So this is a kind of a Japanese status in the discussion of the climate change. And also, as already Phillip-san said, Prime Minister Kishida just find the time to be at the COP. Actually, that he was staying in Glasgow. I have heard that only like 3 hours or something like that, but it was really good. He could be at the COP in person because more than 120 state leaders joined that COP. So if he was not there, it sees as the really kind of a bad image of the Japanese government are not serious about the climate change negotiations. And he gave a speech at COP, but content of the speech was rather severely welcomed by the NGOs. He said, like, since solar power plays a major role in the transition in renewable in Asia, but to help stabilize electrical frequency in the region, converting existing thermal power generations into zero emission power generation is a necessary path. So he said, like, to explore renewables in Asian region, that Asian region has to continue to rely on thermal power, especially coal and gas. And he also mentioned that ammonia and hydrogen, but he didn't mention that which those hydrogen comes from. And then usually the Japanese government current policy is produce the hydrogen from fossil fuel. So again, this relies on the fossil fuel use. So the international NGOs Climate Action Network that gave the Fossil of the Day award that to Japan on 2nd November. Actually, that according to the IEA, in 2040, that if we see the Southeast Asia, it's a kind of a lot of renewables could be introduced, and then not only solar PV, but also other types of renewables. And then you could see like a renewable could be a major resource in Asia that for the decarbonization. So the people that heard the speech by the Prime Minister that thought that it is not acceptable to accelerate the energy transition in Asian region. And also Asia is totally responsible for the climate crisis. And then actually that China is the #1 emitter of the greenhouse gases, but you could see Japan is also emitting that CO2s as well. And actually Japan is the 5th emitter in the world and then 2nd emitter in developed countries. So the Japan's climate policy is really watched by the NGOs and the other countries. And then, for example, like those are the photos of the Japanese youth that this time that attended COP26. And they really concerned about Japan's policy. And then they tried to appeal it to the other part of the world. And then there are so many demonstrations going on in Glasgow outside of the conference hall. And this is a gathering of the 20,000 or the 30,000 people. But on Sunday, it says like the 100,000 people gathered for marching. And I just would like to go through what is happening in the world that besides COP discussion about the energy issue. So this is a COVID and energy use that you could see. COVID affects really the global energy use. So because of the COVID, that the primary energy consumption really dropped. And then this is the first time after World War II. And then the pandemic has changed not only the economy, but also the energy that supports it. The conventional energies, fossil and nuclear, have ceased to grow, and then renewables have made great strides. So this is a kind of a global electricity generation change. And then those changes are happening that in Japan as well. So the Japan's electricity generation, that the fossil fuel and the nuclear declined, but only renewables really grow. And then you could see that the European electricity generation, and this is the US electricity generation around the world, that the similar trend is continuing. And then this is the energy transition globally that you could see that by year and year, but maybe I skip this one. And then related to the renewables, that the renewables really expanding. And you could see that the cost of renewables really declining, that we say like the last 10 years that the PV cost declined by 90%. And also the cost of concentrated solar power generation, that is also declined. And wind power is a stable growth showed. And then now that it reached 733 gigawatt. And then wind has been already competitive in the market, but also the costs have fallen by a further 40% in the last decade. So the renewable is becoming the cheapest energy source around the world. For example, that those are the countries that if you try to install the new generation, that renewable is the cheapest one, like onshore wind in the Northern American countries and South American countries, Brazil and Argentina, and some European countries. And for the PVs, that in China, India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and you could see South Africa and Australia, those are the cheapest energy source already become. And you could see Japan and South Korea and some Southeast Asian countries, like coal is still the cheapest energy source. And then backing with this cost declining, that the renewable is expanding. And for the climate change mitigation, that even IEA is the International Energy Agency, which was born to watch the oil trend in the oil trend globally. And even that organization used to focus on fossil fuel, released the net zero scenario. And they say like about 90% of electricity will be provided by renewable energy by 2050. We could see only the solar and wind is totally expanding by 2050. So we see the solar and wind, those two variable renewable energy source could be the main source of electricity for the decarbonization. And then energy transition is going on in each country, you could see that a lot of ambitious target by the country. So EU recently released the 55% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2030. And then fit for that target, EU said like about 65% of electricity has to be provided by renewables by 2030. And the US, I think that you don't have the kind of a national renewable energy target, but some states, California, New York, Hawaii, they have that huge renewable energy target. And those states want to go for 100% renewables, for example, by 2045. So, and then greenhouse gas reduction targets that you see that by 2050, that all countries already declare the climate neutrality. And this is just a kind of a for example, like this is DOE's latest scenario for expanding renewables. I'm sorry that some languages remain in Japanese, but currently that the US has only 3.4% of solar PV and 8.7 and 7.5 of wind and hydro. But according to the DOE's new study, that by 2035 or 36, that it will reach like almost more than 70% by supplied by solar, onshore and offshore wind. So it's a kind of a huge numbers already set, and then the DOE says it is possible. And then Japan, that I just would like to see how the Japan's greenhouse gas is emitted. So 92% of Japan's greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, and then 93% of which were energy related. So we have to do something in the energy transition if we try to mitigate the climate crisis, and also try to decrease the GHGs. And comparison with other countries, that if we see that Japan is still relying on about 70% to the imported fossil fuel, especially coal and gas that you can see here. And gradually, Japan is increasing renewables, especially from 2012. The government policy was introduced and then supported the growth of the variable renewables, especially the solar PV. So now it's about more than 20% of electricity is supplied by renewables, but compared to other countries, it is still slow, that I have to say. And then which part of the Japan's energy sector is releasing the greenhouse gases? Like half of Japan's greenhouse gases come from just about 130 big businesses. And then 70% for large coal-fired power, more than half of the thermal power emit the greenhouse gases. So about the 30% of greenhouse gases coming from the coal-fired power. So we have to change this trend. But still that in Japan, even in Japan, the renewables are growing, as I already mentioned, that the solar PV really expanded from 5 gigawatt to about 70 gigawatt last year. But if you see that other renewables, especially wind, is very slow to be introduced. But that expansion of PVs that brought that now the almost renewable is becoming the second biggest electricity resource. That is, so the Japan slow, but making progress at the moment. But Japan's government energy plan, this is 2030, for the 2030, the 6 basic energy plan, they still estimate the fossil fuel around the 40% of its electricity mix. and then renewable 36 to 38%. This was already mentioned by Philip. The discussion with the Meti and Kono-san. So this is a newly adopted that basic energy plan, but still that we have this kind of low number that compared to other countries. And then this kind of domestic energy policy really affects to other countries as well. Japan and China are the biggest lenders for coal projects in Indonesia and Vietnam. And then those are the countries that which we can estimate the huge potential of renewables, but still Japan has the big governmental fund to export coal-fired power plant or gas-fired power plant in those regions. I think that the Japanese government has domestic policy of using fossil fuel still, so that affects to the export policy of Japan as well. So what is needed that in Japan that to maximize renewables? Actually, as I said, that the renewables costs are declining globally, but still Japan experiencing the high cost of renewables that in our country. You could see the Japan is, this is a kind of a utility scale solar example. The last year, the most expensive cost of the large scale solar in the world was the Russia Federation, but Japan is the second country which has the highest cost of solar PV installation. And then you could see that which part is expensive is one is inverters and also mechanical installation and electrical installation. Those two are basically the infrastructure cost. And the Japanese government always says Japan has a very small land. So land cost is expensive and it's limited to have the cost reduction of PVs. But the other countries such as Korea and the UK, those countries have the limited land as well, but they could achieve the about 90% of decline in the cost. So it's a kind of a, the flow of the global cost reduction. So the Japan could do more if those kind of cost reduction, especially the construction cost reduction could be done. And also the second thing Japan has to explore is to increase the flexibility in the electricity market and also grid development. Always that the Japanese government and the utilities says like Japan is an island nation, so we cannot install a lot of renewables like EU that which are connected to each other. But I have to say Japan is an island nation, but it's a very big island nation. Some of the transmission operators in Europe says to me, Japan has the Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, and Belgium in its own country. So he would like to mention Japan has a huge demand, electricity demand in the country. So it is like several countries in the nation. So I think that if currently that the 9 parts of the electricity market is divided in Japan, but if it is integrated and the flexibility is increased and the transmission operation could be really become really smooth, that I think that more and more renewable could be installed. And also, as I mentioned, the existing coal is still the cheapest energy source in Japan. But we expect that the renewables cost really rapidly decline even in Japan, but it will not catch up with the existing coal. It's because we do not have the necessary measures like a carbon pricing system to make the coal more, how can I say, internalizing the external cost of coal in the market signal. So we think that the effective carbon pricing system needs to be introduced that in Japan to show the emission of the CO2 could be the expensive, and then could be expensive, and then renewable can be cheaper in the market trend. And then comparison of the government target and our scenarios, that we think that Japan can introduce that more than 45% to 50% of renewables by 2030, and also 100% of renewables by 2050 could be possible. And then this is quite famous photos, but example of 1,900 that is the parade in New York. Car is just one here. And then after 13 years, like horse is just here. So I believe that the development and then progress could be really rapidly done. And then for the investment of those kind of development is not the cost, but it's the investment for the future. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much to you both for the wonderful presentations. I want to move quickly in the interest of time to questions. Philip, are you there? I was wondering about where the Japanese public is, and Kenji Kushida asks a very pertinent, insightful question on that. The Japanese public seems to think of themselves as eco-friendly, and a lot of Japanese big corporations also try to sort of promote the image of them engaging in more eco-friendly activities, innovations. But there is a discrepancy between that perception, maybe only within Japan, and the rankings that you both showed. Well, actually, Philip's ranking was worse than Japan ranked worse than in Mika-san's ranking. So maybe you can talk about the discrepancy between. I mean, US was better than Japan in Philip's ranking, but much worse than Japan in Mika-san's ranking. I think these are measuring two different things probably, so we can talk a little bit about it. But so where is the public? Are they really interested in addressing climate change issues? And if so, maybe it's because of the supply side issues, as Philip was talking about, the cost. And there's a question from Ohbayashi about coal being the cheapest energy form in Japan. And I think Mika-san answered this question a little bit already, but if externalities are factored in, is coal still the cheapest energy in Japan? That was the question from Ohbayashi. And Robert Feldman asks a question about the most promising technology to reduce greenhouse gases in Japan and in the world. I think these are two different questions, right? What's most promising in Japan might not be the most promising technology in the world. So if you could talk about which technology, I guess he's asking about among the renewable energies, which one is the most promising, which one, and how can that be adopted by a lot of countries, a lot of actors in the world? I put in a lot, but if you could address that, that would be great. Let's start with Philip.
Sure. No, these are great questions. I'll just briefly comment on the consumer side. I think if you look at public opinion polls of Japanese consumers, it tends to show that the average Japanese person cares a lot about climate change. So it's not that they're unconcerned, but there's also a lot of resistance to demand side policies that might help push progress on CO2 emissions reduction. So there's a lot of opposition to things like gasoline taxes, carbon taxes, and so forth. So there's a little bit of a mismatch there. There's an aspiration Japan should do better on climate change, but let somebody else pay for the cost. Tends to be where the general public stands. And I think that does connect to the supply side questions. But generally speaking, it's difficult to implement large-scale supply-side policies without having the consumer bear some of the costs. It's possible for the government to take on the additional cost, but then you get into questions of, well, where does that money come from, right? Is Japan going to issue even more debt and so forth? So I think that is an issue. On Kenji's question about the interest groups, I think the research on climate change, not just in Japan, but elsewhere, shows that as you keep on moving along the supply side transition, it does create an important support base for continued transformation. So if you get a big solar industry, a big offshore wind industry, that becomes an important political constituency for continuing that change that counterbalances some of the resistance to renewables. So I do think that is an important factor, and some of the shift that we're seeing in Japan is reflective of that, I would say, and that's probably some grounds for optimism. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great, Mika-san.
Yeah, actually, that the consumer side, there are so many companies that's already in the question that show the interest in the decarbonization, as well as they want to buy renewables. But the problem is like Japan's renewable cost is high. And the second, that we do not have the efficient measures for the large consumers to buy renewables from the electricity market. Only the power retailer can buy the electricity and sell the electricity to the consumers. So the large consumers really want the government to deregulate the market system for them to easier procurement of the renewables. Actually, that the Kono Taro under the task force of the renewable energy deregulation that we committed that discussion. So the for example, in the US, that there is possible that the PPA power purchase agreement with the large consumer directly contract with the renewable energy power producer, and then ensure them to buy the 10 years at a certain price or something like that. But in Japan, that we cannot do that. So maybe that we have to explore those kind of system to be integrated in the Japanese power market. So that is one thing. And then I think that it is quite interesting that the trend, because we have been talking about supply side in past decades, but now the consumers join the discussion that they demand the more and more renewables in the market. And then that is changing the trend of the power supply side as well. That is my comment.
Right, so to follow up a little bit, Mika-san, you have been in the government councils on those issues. What was the emphasis? Well, I guess the administration changed, so it may have changed as well. But among the renewables, what would be the most appropriate, effective option for Japan in particular? And also, there is this giant elephant in the room, which is nuclear energy. And Prime Minister Kishida seemed to move in the direction of restarting some of the nuclear plants. Where is that discussion, and how would that shape the trajectory of Japan's energy policy as because a lot of people argue that nuclear has to be 20-some% of Japan's energy mix for Japan to reach the target goal by 2030 and to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So can you comment a little bit on that discussion that you've been involved in?
And then under the new administration, I see some, how can I say, slowing down of the progress of the carbon neutrality and then renewable expansion. Actually, that it is not like last year, but still the renewable energy deployment will continue under our current administration, because more and more companies and more industry really interested in buying renewables and promoting renewables, because that is the kind of last resort for the big investment. For example, the offshore wind power, the Japanese government has almost the largest target globally, like a 45 gigawatt by 2040. And then so much in international industries, and then the wind power industries, and then financial sectors are interested in that trend. So I think that the renewable energy will not be stopped even under this current administration, but it is important to have the more kind of a strengthening of the grid and flexibility in the electricity system. That is most important. And if I see that the potential of the renewables, that the solar PV may continue to play the major role in future as well. But for that we need to have the more flexible electricity market as well. And then we have to see the kind of a smaller scale of solar on the rooftop solar. And according to our study by 2050, it says like about the half of renewable electricity will be provided by PV solar, but the half of its PV solar will be provided by prosumer. So not the kind of only consumer, but the prosumer side. So that has the huge potential. So the prosumer type of solar PV and also bigger scale of offshore wind. And then regarding nuclear power, probably the acceleration of restart of nuclear power will start. But still, that even after this year is the 10th memorial of the Fukushima nuclear accident, and even after 10 years, or of course that I can say, I cannot say even, but more than 60% of the Japanese public against to continue to rely on nuclear power. So I think that the government target of 20 to 22% by 2030 is quite difficult or unrealistic. And then still now we have the 3 to 5% of nuclear power in the electricity mix. So I think that it will not be like 10% by 2030. I think that it will be 5 to 6% at most, but not more than that. And for restarting nuclear is becoming more and more expensive at the same time. For example, that the one sample of the nuclear power plant, like Tokai and Onagawa, that we could see that it's already double the cost of construction. The reason because that the nuclear power plant has the lifetime, 40 years or 60 years time. So, with the delaying of the restarting nuclear power, they just consuming the rest of the lifetime. And it means that the increase of their cost for the restarting. So I think that the nuclear power is becoming really expensive in Japan. And then it is not, it cannot be said that even the existing nuclear power is cheaper.
Great, and on that point, I hope you don't mind us going over a few minutes. These are questions to Philip for the most part. What is the political cost? This is a question from Kenji again. Political cost of restarting nuclear plants. Is it too much? Or it isn't, we don't know yet, but you can comment on that. And also from Robert Feldman, Japan currently imports about 3.5% of GDP in fossil fuel. So with domestic renewables, couldn't that transition pay for itself? Another kind of macroeconomic question. Finally, from our question from RB, how susceptible is Japan's infrastructure to huge economic losses as a result of climate change, such as sea level rise, flooding, drought, and so on? What are the tangible impact of climate change per se on Japan? Maybe the last question might be more for Mika-san, but anyway, for Philip, take questions, whichever you like.
Yeah, sure. On the nuclear question, my take on nuclear is that new construction is probably not feasible politically. Restarts are a little bit more complicated. It depends a little bit on the local context. I don't think Japan is going to get back to capacity, close to what it used to have on nuclear, but kind of a gradual restart seems politically feasible. Whether Japan ends up going down that route or not, I think is an open question. There's considerable resistance at the local level in various places, but there are also some areas where local politicians are very much in support of nuclear because it provides economic benefits. So I think that's a complicated one. But new nuclear construction, I would be very surprised if that's on the table. On Robert's question, I think this is an interesting one. So, if you think about Japan's long-term energy security, if you can get an economy that is run mostly on renewables and electric vehicles, right, you've solved this very, very long-term problem that Japan has always faced of being reliant on overseas energy resources. In some sense, it's not just about climate change, right? As an energy security solution, a big shift to renewables is in Japan's national interest. And so in that sense, because of geopolitics and because of economics, I think there is a very, very compelling case for renewables. And I think the current government policy perhaps doesn't quite recognize those kinds of additional benefits to the renewable transition as much as it should. But I'll let Mika-san answer the final question. Thank you.
Yeah. Mika-san, the question is, what are there going to be dire consequences, like some of the island nations in the Indo-Pacific are experiencing? Are they going to happen something similar or related? Going to happen to Japan?
Of course, that if the climate crisis, that if we cannot change, that it will happen. But even now that we are suffered from heavy rain, and then not the kind of typhoon, but the heavy rain caused some floods in Japan. So I could say that Japan is always facing climate change and then climate crisis, like other countries. So, so of course that the flood and then etc. will happen, that continuously happen, that if we cannot change this trend. And then just a little bit about the kind of renewables can solve the fossil fuel expense or something like that. According to our scenario, that by 2050, that the renewable could be a more really major source of electricity and energy. And then that we could, of course, that the major impact is that we do not rely on the fossil fuel that imported. So that will just a kind of a balance the cost of installation of new renewables and new infrastructure. And then what we have to see is that what the Phillip-san said, that it's a kind of energy security. And if the other countries have the 60%, 70%, 80% of renewable energy target, it means they can get electricity source from the almost zero cost of energy by that time. So I think that the Japanese government has to think seriously that how we can change this kind of Japanese government trend to relying on imported fossil fuel. And then as Philip said, that it's a kind of a geopolitics thing as well.
Great, thank you. We have to close, but I want to give you both of you the final word on the question of, let's say, what should be the top priority for Prime Minister Kishida in addressing climate change, one, and what should be the top priority for the Japanese public or corporations, non-governmental actors. Each of you can probably take one of the question, then if you want to add some more thoughts and insights, that would be great. We can start with either one. Philip, maybe?
Sure. I think for Prime Minister Kishida, the priority is really supporting the supply side transition. I think the demand side is challenging, but the Japanese government has a lot that it can do on the supply side that really has to do with interest group politics, the kinds of things that I think the government is capable of overcoming. And for the public, I would say holding the political leaders accountable and really putting the pressure on politicians to actually commit to doing things that they're talking about publicly, right? So if you're going to talk about climate change, are the policies there to actually move Japan in the right direction? I think sort of holding politicians accountable, watching what they do, that's quite critical. Thank
for the Kishida-san and current administration, it is urgently need to decide phase out governmental support for exporting coal-fired power plant. That is really urgently requested by other countries. And also that, for example, UN requesting the G7 countries to phase out coal-fired power plant by 2030, but still Japan has a 19% in the electricity mix by 2030. And then this domestic trend has to be changed really rapidly. And also, of course, that for us and then other corporations, actually that we encourage the business leaders to take more active climate change actions, like in the States, like a kind of a non-state actors activities really encouraging. So as we have to request the government that like a kind of a smooth transition for the renewables, and then there has to be the easier way for the large consumers to buy renewables or make their energy transition.
Wonderful. I think that Japan's export of coal plants was discussed in this APAC series for the Southeast Asian program session. So this is an important issue that affects all Asia. So thank you very much. This was very insightful. I learned a lot, and I hope the audience, I'm sure the audience did too. It'd be great to, well, not 2030, maybe a little bit before that, but it'd be good to have you both come on to review Japan's progress or lack thereof, hopefully progress at a future time. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights with us, Philip and Mika-san. And see you next time.
Thanks for having us.